Once upon a time there was a miller who gave his 3 sons everything he had, and all he had was a mill, a donkey, and a cat. The 3 boys divided things up as best they could. The eldest got the mill, the second the donkey, and the third the cat. Now the youngest son was very unhappy at his share. "My brothers can get along well with their mill and their donkey," he said, "but what can I do with a cat? It can't grind flour, it can't carry anything. I'll be lucky if it can feed itself." Now the cat heard all this, so he went to his master and said, "Don't worry, good master. If you'll give me a bag and a pair of boots, I'll show you that you haven't gotten the worst of the bargain." Now the youngest son had often seen Puss play cunning tricks to catch rats and mice, so he wasn't a bit surprised that it could talk. He gave the cat what it asked for, and waited to see what would happen. Puss put on his boots and tied the bag around his neck. Then he went into a field where he knew there were a lot of rabbits. He put some rabbit food, lettuce and carrots, into the bag. Then he stretched himself out, pretending to be asleep, and waited for some curious rabbits. He had no more than lain down when a foolish young bunny jumped right into the bag. Mr. Puss immediately drew the strings, and there was the rabbit, caught in his trap. Puss knew just what to do next. He took the rabbit to the palace of the king and asked to speak with his majesty. He was shown to the king's council room, where he made a low bow and said to him, "Your Majesty, I have here for you a rabbit. It was sent to you by my lord the Marquis of Carabas," for that was what Puss decided to call his master. "He asked me to bring it to you." Now the king was very pleased by this, and he said, "Tell your master that I accept his gift with pleasure." A few days later, Puss went into a cornfield and tried the same trick on a run of quail. The very same thing happened to them. They were caught in his bag. Puss went to the king again and gave him the quail, and this time his majesty was so pleased that he gave Puss a bag of fine gold. Well, this went on for 2 or 3 months. Puss brought the king presents, and the king was more and more impressed with him. Now one day, Puss learned that the king was going to take a drive by the river with his daughter, and this daughter, you must know, was said to be the most beautiful princess in the world. Puss went to his master and said, "If you will do as I say, your fortune is made. Go down to the river for a swim, and leave the rest to me. But be sure to remember that you are the Marquis of Carabas." Now Puss had been so smart and had done so much for his master that the master thought he'd better do as he was told, and he went to the river for a swim. Sure enough, while he was swimming, the king and the princess drove by in their carriage. At that moment the cat cried out as loud as he could, "Help! Help! The Marquis of Carabas is drowning!" When the king heard this, he stuck his head out of the coach window and commanded his guards to save the Marquis. While they were saving the poor Marquis from a watery death in the river, the cat told the king that some thieves had stolen his master's clothes while he had been swimming. Now clever Puss had really hidden them under a stone because they were so shabby. So the king ordered the officers to run home to the palace and bring one of his best suits for his friend, the Marquis of Carabas. When the Marquis was dressed in them, he looked so handsome that the king's daughter immediately fell in love with him. Then the king invited the Marquis to ride with him in the coach, and away they went. Meanwhile, Puss was delighted to see his plan work out so wonderfully. He marched on ahead and made further arrangements. He came to a broad meadow where some people were mowing, and he stopped and said to them, "Good people, if you don't tell the king that this meadow belongs to my lord the Marquis of Carabas, you shall be chopped as fine as parsley, each one of you." Naturally, the people were frightened by his words, and when the king stopped to ask the mowers who owned the meadow, they all replied in one voice, "My lord, the Marquis of Carabas." The cat still kept ahead of the king in his carriage. The next place he stopped was a huge field of corn where some reapers were working. He said the very same thing to them, so that when the king came by and asked who owned all the corn in the field, they answered in a body, "My lord, the Marquis of Carabas." And the king became more and more impressed with his unexpected guest. Puss said the same thing to everyone he met, and the king was so astonished at the huge estates of the Marquis that he didn't know what to say. At last Puss arrived at a stately castle. Now the master of this castle was a wicked ogre, the richest and most powerful ogre that ever lived. All the lands the king had driven through really belonged to him. Puss knew this perfectly well, and he also knew that the ogre could practice all sorts of magic. So Puss went into the castle to pay the ogre a visit. The ogre received him as nicely as an ogre can and asked him to sit down. Puss sat himself comfortably in a deep red chair, and then he said, "I have heard that you have the power to change yourself into any kind of animal, that you can turn yourself into an elephant, a lion, or even a deer if you want to." "That's quite true," rumbled the ogre. "In fact, I'll prove it to you and change myself into a lion." In an instant, the ogre changed himself into a lion, and Puss was so frightened that he tried to climb out the window. Then the ogre turned back into his natural self again and apologized for frightening our Puss. "I've heard also," went on Puss, "but I find it hard to believe, that you can change yourself into the smallest of animals, that you could even change yourself into a mouse. But I must confess, I believe this to be impossible." "Impossible?" roared the ogre. "Nothing is impossible for me. Look, I'll show you." And in a twinkling, the ogre changed himself into a mouse and scampered across the floor. Now this was exactly what Puss had planned, and he reached out with his paw, caught the mouse, and gobbled him up. Now just at this time, the king came to the great castle that had belonged to the ogre. He decided that he really ought to pay the owner a visit, and when Puss heard his Majesty's carriage go over the drawbridge, he ran out and said to the king, "I welcome you to the castle of my lord the Marquis of Carabas." "Well, do you mean that this castle belongs to you too?" asked the king in amazement. Why, this is the finest castle in the land, finer even than my own. I should like to go into it, if you please." So they all went into the castle. Puss led them to a great dining hall where the table was spread with a feast, which was really the ogre's midday meal. Now the king thought and thought about all the good qualities of the Marquis, including his rich estates. And before the end of the meal, he asked the Marquis if he would like to marry his daughter. As you might have guessed, the Marquis bowed gratefully and accepted immediately. A few weeks later, he and the lovely princess were married. They lived in the castle that had formerly belonged to the ogre, and of course, you may be sure they lived happily ever after. Now as for Puss, as you know, he had brought about all this good fortune. The Marquis made him a great lord, and he was given 20 pairs of beautiful red boots and an enormous black hat, and also he was given a title. He lived in a little palace of his own, and he never had to run after mice again, except, of course, for his own amusement. On a lonely slope of mountain there once stood an ancient pine tree right in front of a cave. And in this cave lived a strange little creature who was neither a badger nor a bear, but a gnome, a timid little dwarf. This little fellow had seen better days, for once long, long ago he had been a king and had worn a golden crown. Well, he was still enormously wealthy, but he was no longer king, for even dwarfs change their rulers. And day after day, as he sat sunning himself under the ancient pine tree, he thought how much he would like to be married and have someone to take care of him in his old age. Usually, when he went outside, he wore his magic cap that made him invisible, but sometimes he forgot it. And so it happened that the people on the mountain knew him well and called him Zirbel. One day, when he was lying, as he often did, under his tree, he heard two people climbing up the mountain path. He quickly put on his magic cap and watched them. It was an old farmer and his young rosy-cheeked daughter. They were climbing up the mountain to find a good place to build themselves a home, and they found it not far from Zirbel's cave. By the time the sun was ready to set, the old man had finished quite a comfortable hut, and then the two of them sat down to supper. All this while Zirbel watched them closely. He was so pleased at the sight of the lovely young girl that for the first time in years a friendly smile played over his face. He soon discovered that Lisi, for that was her name, picked the wildflowers and sold them to the tourists who stayed at the inn. Zirbel decided to help her, so he stirred up the earth fires. And one day, Lisi noticed that thousands and thousands of flowers had pushed themselves up out of the ground. She had never seen such beautiful ones before. And day after day, wearing his magic cap, Zirbel followed her and watched her at her work. He was very happy. All went well until one day a young huntsman came to the hut. He and Lisi seemed to be great friends, and the dwarf was terribly jealous. When it was time for him to leave, Lisi walked part of the way down the mountain with her young man, and her father stood in front of the hut watching after them. Suddenly, Zirbel stood before the old man, and he nearly frightened him out of his wits. "Do you know me?" asked the dwarf. Why, you must be Sir Zirbel," replied the father. "You are right," replied the dwarf. "You are Master Peter, and I have come to tell you that you have a beautiful daughter." "Oh, yes, I know," said the father. "She is beautiful, but she is poor, too poor to marry her young man. Oh, Master Zirbel, don't you know of some buried treasure for her?" At this the dwarf nodded his head quickly and said, "Come with me, if you are not afraid, and I will show you treasure that's richer than you can imagine." Old Peter followed the dwarf, who led him to the pine tree, and from there to the mouth of his cave. Down, down they went on a narrow, winding path. Soon it grew wider, and they seemed in an enormous room. "Look around you," commanded the dwarf. And in the light of blue flickering flames, the old man saw an amazing sight. Great silver icicles hung from the ceiling, and the walls were covered with the richest gold. And on the floor of the room stood row after row of copper kettles, filled to the brim with silver and gold. The old man had never seen anything like it in his whole life. Then the dwarf said, "All these treasures will be your daughters, on one condition." "And what is that, Sir Zirbel?" asked the old man eagerly. "That she give up her huntsman and marry me." "Have you any objections?" Now these words really frightened the old man, for it's not well to quarrel with dwarfs. So he thought for a while and then said, "For my part, Sir Zirbel, I have no objections, but I cannot speak for my daughter. She must decide for herself." Zirbel went on talking, and as he did so he scooped up silver and gold pieces out of the kettles and let them fall back again, till poor Peter was so dazzled that his head was all of a whirl. But suddenly he had an idea and said, "Sir Zirbel, you shall visit my daughter. You shall see her at home and at her work. Then, if you still wish to marry her, you shall have my blessings. But if you, of your own free will, refuse to marry her after what you will see, you must give me a bag full of gold." Zirbel was delighted with this idea, and he quickly filled a huge bag with gold as the old man had asked. Then the two made their way to the daylight again and walked toward old Peter's hut. Now old Peter had suddenly remembered that dwarfs fly like the wind from anything that has to do with the arts. They can't stand painting or poetry or music, and so he arranged that they should walk to his hut by a path that he knew. After they'd been walking some time, they came upon a young lady painting with brushes and oils. Zirbel sneaked up behind her and watched for a while. Then he went back to old Peter. "What on earth is she doing?" he asked. "Why, she is painting, Sir Zirbel. She spends hours and hours painting mountains and trees and people, just like my Lisi." "Tell me, does Lisi spend her time so foolishly?" asked Zirbel. "Oh, yes, indeed," said her father. Then the dwarf grumbled under his breath, and the two went on again. Not long after they came to a second girl, and she was sitting on a rock looking at the blue sky. In her left hand she held a book on which was written in gold letters the word poetry. She seemed to be in a dream, and the dwarf asked Peter pityingly what was the matter with the poor thing. "Oh, she's writing poetry. She writes rhymes in her book, and then she reads them out loud." "Tell me, Master Peter," said the dwarf fearfully, "does Lisi write poetry too?" And Peter replied, "Oh, yes. When she's tired of painting, why, she scribbles rhymes, and she reads them too." "Oh, dear," sighed Zirbel. "Well, let's go on." And they continued on their way. The sun was just setting, and still old Peter and Zirbel hadn't arrived at the hut. But they had come to a fine house, and through the windows came a sound that seemed so fearful to Zirbel that he hid himself quickly behind a rock. "Why, there's nothing to be afraid of," said old Peter soothingly. "If you peek in that window, you will see what is causing the noise." So Zirbel peeked into the lighted room. "I see two girls," he said softly, "and they're pounding on some sort of box. Oh, it's horrible. Tell me, old Peter, what does it mean? Why, they're only playing the piano. It's a common practice, replied Peter. This time Zirbel was really upset. Tell me, he said in a trembling voice, does Lizzie play that terrible thing too? Oh, yes, said Peter. Sometimes she plays as much as 6 hours at a time. Oh, she loves it too. At this the dwarf groaned sadly and was silent for a long time. Finally old Peter said, Sir Zirbel, we'd better be on our way. There was no answer, and the old man looked about for the dwarf, but he was nowhere to be found. Sir Zirbel, he called out still louder, where are you? At that moment Zirbel appeared, carrying his heavy sack of gold over his shoulder. He threw it at Peter's feet and said, Master Peter, the treasure is yours, and you may keep your daughter as well. I fear our marriage would not be a happy one. And so saying, he disappeared. Clever Peter would have jumped for joy if the heavy bag of gold hadn't made it impossible. He waved his hat toward the spot where he had last seen Zirbel, and then he hurried as fast as he could towards his home. And this is the end of the story, for you can easily guess what happened when old Peter arrived home. Of course, the beautiful Lisi married her huntsman, and as for the dwarf Zirbel, he never gave marriage another thought in his whole long life. High above the city on a tall column stood the statue of the Happy Prince. He was gilded all over with thin leaves of fine gold. For eyes he had 2 bright sapphires, and a large red ruby glowed on his sword hilt. He was very much admired indeed. "Why can't you be like the Happy Prince?" asked a sensible mother of her little boy who was crying for the moon. "The Happy Prince never dreams of crying for anything." "I'm glad there's someone in the world who's quite happy," muttered a disappointed man as he gazed at the wonderful statue. "He looks just like an angel," said all of the children. One night there flew over the city a little swallow. His friends had gone away to Egypt 6 weeks before, but he had stayed behind, for he was in love with a most beautiful reed. But now our swallow felt very lonely and began to tire of his lady love. "I'm off to the pyramids," he cried one day. "Goodbye." And he flew away. All day long he flew, and at night he arrived in the city. "Now where shall I stay?" he thought. And then he saw the statue on the tall column, so he alighted just between the feet of the Happy Prince. "I have a golden bedroom," he said as he prepared to go to sleep. But just as he was putting his head under his wing, a large drop of water fell on him. "What a curious thing!" he cried. "There isn't a single cloud in the sky, and yet it is raining." Then another drop fell. "What's the use of a statue if it can't keep the rain off? I'd better look for a good chimney pot." And he decided to fly away. But before he had opened his wings, a third drop fell, and he looked up and saw... What did he see? The eyes of the Happy Prince were filled with tears, and tears were running down his golden cheeks. His face was so beautiful in the moonlight that the little swallow felt very sorry for him. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am the Happy Prince." "Why are you weeping then?" "When I was alive and had a human heart," answered the statue, "I did not know what tears were, for I lived in the palace of Sans Souci, where sorrow is not allowed to enter. But now that I am dead, they have set me up here so high that I can see all the ugliness and all the misery of my city, and though my heart is made of lead, I cannot help weeping. Far, far away in a little street there is a poor house. One of the windows is open, and through it I can see a woman seated at a table. Her face is thin and worn, and her hands are red and scratched by a needle. She is embroidering passion flowers on a satin gown for the loveliest of the Queen's maids of honor to wear at the next court ball. In a bed in the corner of the room her little boy is lying ill. He has a fever. Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not bring her the ruby out of my sword hilt? My feet are fastened to this pedestal, and I cannot move. I don't think I like boys, answered the swallow. But the happy prince looked so sad that the little swallow was sorry. It's very cold here, he said, but I will stay with you for one night and be your messenger. Thank you, said the prince. So the swallow picked out the great ruby from the prince's sword and flew away with it in his beak. On his way he passed by the palace and heard the sound of dancing. A beautiful girl came out on the balcony with her young man. "Oh, how wonderful the stars are," he said to her. "I do hope my dress will be ready in time for the state ball," she answered. "I have ordered passion flowers to be embroidered on it." At last the swallow came to the poor little house and looked in. The boy was tossing on his bed, and the mother had fallen asleep. She was so tired. In he hopped and laid the great ruby on the table beside the poor woman's thimble. Then the swallow flew back to the happy prince and told him what he had done, and then he fell asleep. Next morning the swallow perched himself on the shoulder of the happy prince and said, "Tonight I go to Egypt. Have you any messages for me?" "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not stay with me one night longer?" "But I am waited for in Egypt," answered the swallow. "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, far away across the city I see a young man in an attic. He is leaning over a desk covered with papers, and in a glass by his side there is a bunch of withered violets. He is trying to finish a play, but he is too cold to write any more, and hunger has made him weak." "I will wait with you one night longer," said the swallow. "Shall I take him another ruby?" "Alas, I have no ruby now," said the prince. "My eyes are all that I have left. They are made of rare sapphires. Pluck out one of them and take it to him." "Oh, dear prince, I cannot do that." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, do as I command you." So the swallow plucked out the prince's eye and flew away to the student's garret. The young man had his head buried in his hands, so he didn't hear the flutter of the bird's wings. And when he looked up, he found the beautiful sapphire lying on the withered violets. The next day the swallow again perched himself on the shoulder of the happy prince and said, "I must bid you good-bye." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, will you not stay with me one night longer?" "Oh, but it's winter, and the chill snow will soon be here." "In the square below," said the happy prince, "there stands a little match girl. She has dropped her matches in the gutter, and they're all spoiled. Now she cannot sell them and bring home some money, so she's crying. Pluck out my other eye and give it to her." "I will stay with you one night longer," said the swallow, "but I cannot pluck out your eye. You would be quite blind then." "Swallow, swallow, little swallow, do as I command you." So the swallow plucked out the prince's eye and darted down with it. He swooped past the little match girl and slipped the jewel into the palm of her hand. "Why, what a lovely bit of glass!" cried the little girl, and she ran home laughing. Then the swallow came back to the prince. "You are blind now, so I will stay with you always." And he slept at the prince's feet. All the next day he sat on the prince's shoulder and told him stories of what he had seen in strange lands. "Dear little swallow," said the prince, "you tell me of marvelous things, but more marvelous than anything is the suffering of men and of women. I am covered with fine gold. You must take it off leaf by leaf and give it to my poor." So leaf after leaf of the fine gold the swallow picked off, till the happy prince looked quite dull and gray. Leaf after leaf of the fine gold he brought to the poor, and the children's faces grew rosier, and they laughed and played games in the street. "We have bread now," they cried. Then the snow came, and after the snow came the frost. The poor little swallow grew colder and colder, but he would not leave the prince. At last he knew that he was going to die. He had just strength to fly up to the prince's shoulder once more. "Goodbye, dear prince," he murmured. "I must leave you now." And he kissed the happy prince and fell dead at his feet. At that moment a curious crack sounded inside the statue, as if something had broken. The fact is that the leaden heart had snapped right in two. Early next morning the mayor was walking in the square below. As he passed the column he looked up at the statue. "Dear me, how shabby the happy prince looks! The ruby has fallen out of his sword, his eyes are gone, and he is golden no longer. In fact, he is little better than a beggar." So they pulled down the statue of the happy prince and melted it in a furnace. "What a strange thing," said the overseer at the foundry. "This broken lead heart will not melt. We must throw it away." So he threw it on a rubbish heap, where the dead swallow was also lying. "Bring me the two most precious things in the city," said God to one of his angels. And the angel brought him the lead heart and the little swallow. "You have rightly chosen, for in my garden of paradise this little bird shall sing forevermore, and in my city of gold the happy prince shall praise me." There once ruled in Russia a strong and powerful Tsar, and among his servants was a young archer. Now this archer had the most marvelous horse. It was a great horse with a broad chest. It had eyes like fire and hoofs of iron. There are no such horses nowadays. One day, in the spring of the year, the young archer rode through the forest on this horse. As he rode, he listened for the songs of the birds, but there were none to be heard. The forest was strangely silent. "I wonder what has happened to the birds," he thought. And at that moment he saw a great curving feather lying in his path. The feather was larger than a swan's, larger even than an eagle's, and it lay there glittering like a flame. It was a feather of pure gold. Then he knew why there had been no singing in the forest. The golden feather belonged to the Firebird. The young archer started to pick it up, Then his horse spoke to him. "Leave the golden feather where it lays," said the horse. "If you take it, it will bring you sorrow, and you will know fear." These words only made the brave young archer want to prove his courage, so he leapt from his saddle, picked up the golden feather, and galloped back through the forest to the palace of the Tsar. When he arrived, he took it straight to the Tsar. The Tsar looked at it and was delighted, but then he said, "If you can bring me a feather of the Firebird, surely you can bring me the bird itself. If you do not, I swear by my sword that your head will no longer sit on your shoulders." At these words the young archer bowed low and went out into the courtyard where his horse was waiting for him. He told the horse of the Tsar's command. "I warned you," said the horse, "that if you took the feather you would learn the meaning of fear. But do not be frightened yet. Trouble has not yet come. Go back to the Tsar and ask him to have 100 sacks of corn scattered over an open field tonight at midnight." So the young archer went back to the Tsar with this strange request. Next morning at dawn he rode to the open field on his horse. Suddenly the sky turned red and gold, a mighty wind blew, the trees bent double to the earth, and the Firebird came flying from the other side of the world. It spread its huge golden wings and dropped into the field. Then it began to eat the corn. Softer than a whisper, the horse circled nearer and nearer the Firebird. Finally, the horse was close enough to step on the wingtip of the bird. This he did, and the bird was caught. Then the young archer slipped from his horse's back and lifted the great bird to his saddle. Then he rode back to the Tsar. When the Tsar saw the bird with its broad wings like fiery shields, he swelled with pride. No other Tsar had ever owned the Firebird. Then his eyes narrowed, and he said to the young archer, "Since you have been able to bring me the Firebird, you must know how to bring me my bride. Her name is Vasilisa, and she lives in the land of Never, on the edge of the world. If you bring her to me, you will be richly rewarded, but if you do not, your head will no longer sit on your shoulders." When the horse heard of this new trouble, he told the young archer to ask the Tsar for a silver tent with a golden roof and food and drink for a long journey. The Tsar gave him what he asked for, and the young archer rode far away into the land of Never. He rode on and on to the edge of the world. Here he looked out over the blue sea and saw the Princess Vasilisa sitting in a little silver boat with golden sails. On the edge of the shore he set up his shining tent, and in the tent he set out many plates of fine food the Tsar had given him. Then he sat down himself and began to eat. The little Princess Vasilisa looked over the blue sea to the edge of the world and saw the silver tent with its golden roof shining in the sunlight. She sailed nearer to see it better, and the nearer she came, the fairer it seemed. Finally she sailed right up to the golden sand, stepped out daintily, and walked over to the tent. When she came to the door, the young archer rose and bowed before her. Then he said, "Good day, Princess. Would you share my midday meal with me?" She said she'd be delighted to, but no sooner had she eaten the first bite than she fell into a deep sleep. Quickly the young archer called his horse and lifted the lovely little princess to the saddle. Lightly as a feather, they rode back to the palace of the Tsar. When the Tsar saw the princess, he was overjoyed. He commanded the trumpets to sound for his wedding. When she heard them, she woke up and realized that she was a prisoner. She looked at the cruel face of the Tsar and was very sad. Then she looked at the fine face of the young archer, and she knew what she must do. "In the middle of the sea," she said, "lies a great stone, and under that stone is my wedding dress. If I cannot wear that dress, I shall never marry." Instantly the Tsar said to the young archer, "Bring me the princess' wedding dress. If you do not, you know what will happen." For the third time the young archer went sadly to his horse, and for the third time the horse was ready to help him. Together they rode back again to the land of Never. The horse stood on the edge of the world and looked along the shore, and at last he saw what he was searching for, a giant red lobster. It was moving slowly towards them across the golden sand. Since it was moving sideways, it didn't see them until it was too late. For when it was close by, the horse lifted an iron hoof and set it firmly on the lobster's tail. The lobster begged for its life, and the horse agreed on one condition: if the lobster brought them the wedding dress of the Princess Vasilisa, he could go free. The lobster said he would, and in less time than it takes to tell, he had dived into the sea and returned. With him he brought a golden chest, and inside it was the wedding dress. Instantly the horse galloped back to the palace of the Tsar. When the young archer gave the princess the golden chest, he looked at her sadly, but she smiled back at him. The bells rang and the flags waved, but the princess said, "I will marry no one until the man who brought me here has gone through the test of fire." Instantly the Tsar commanded a huge fire to be built. When it was hottest, he ordered the young archer to walk through it. "I would see for myself if it is hot enough," said the princess. So she went to the fire and held her hand over it. Some people say there was something in her hand. Some people say there was not. "It is hot enough," she then said. The young archer looked at her and walked bravely into the fire. But then he came out again. The fire hadn't touched him. "Why, this is a miracle," said the Tsar. "If he can go through fire, so can I." And before the princess could stop him, he ran into the fire and disappeared in a cloud of smoke. The end of the story is that the young archer was made Tsar in his place, and, as you may have suspected, he married the Princess Vasilisa. They lived together many, many years, and he built a golden stable for his wonderful horse and never forgot all that he owed to him.